Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how can we use the results from movement analyses to aid the design of S&C activities and skill practice? Data-driven training for soccer goalkeeping. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about a couple extra things that might interest you if you're enjoying the podcast. First, my book, How We Learn to Move, A Revolution in the Way We Coach and Practice Sports Skills, is now available in audiobook format. You can find it on Audible or Amazon. Second, if you're interested in working directly with me, I currently have openings in my monthly mentorship program. This includes monthly Zoom meetings, either one-on-one or with your staff, analysis of your practice designs, and a monthly group discussion with coaches and instructors from a range of different sports. To find out more, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Now on to the show. Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, I want to consider the topic of what you might call data-driven training, right? So how do we take the information we get from movement analyses, studies of skilled performance, biomechanics analyses, and actually take that and use that information in the weight room, in S&C training, and on the field and doing skill training? How do we connect and link these things? And this is something I talked about previously back in an article review I did in 2021. How can we take biomechanics to the sports to improve sports performance? And in that episode, I emphasized, what we might want to do is try to work towards individual optimization, right? Identifying movement solutions that might be the most effective given the individual constraints and intrinsic dynamics of a performer, and try to coach towards developing those. Right? And you can go back and listen to that if you're interested. Today, I want to focus on a really interesting new article by Ibrahim and colleagues on data-driven strength and conditioning and technical training program for soccer goalkeepers, and then focusing on the diving save. This is a very recent article coming out in Sports Biomechanics. I thank the authors again for sending me a copy. So in this study, they're taking as a starting point data from about effective movement patterns in the diving save and soccer goalkeeping, right? So they look at a long history of research from biomechanics and other types of research, showing, for example, things that, using the diving with the bottom hand rather than the top hand towards the ball is more effective, right? It's in greater horizontal coverage. The diving with the contralateral leg, the one on the opposite side of where you're going, is more effective. It generates more forces, more velocity. And there's also research showing that having a wider stance, a PSW, preparatory stance width, before you move, results in more effective movement, quicker change of direction, faster movement times, and so on. Right? So these are all data that we've collected analyzing movement patterns for this skill, right? It doesn't mean that there's one ideal solution, right? It means that there's certain properties of effective movements, right? And I always talk about this, a lot of people kind of ask me about this when we talk about things like attractors and some of the work Franz Bosch does. To me, that's not the same as an ideal solution. There's properties and principles of effective movement, keeping the kinetic chain together, generating good hip locks, right? That are properties that go across a lot of activities and principles. They're not, an ideal technique. The principles that make for movements more effective and more faster, quick and higher velocity, and so on, that we should try to work towards if we can in keeping these principles, like keeping the kinetic chain together. So for me, this is an example of these. We've identified some principles about how effective diving save in soccer. How do we use this information to design strength and conditioning and technical training and skill training, right? So in this study, for example, this is just showing kind of the information about using your ipsilateral foot versus contralateral foot for diving and soccer, right? So two very different movement solutions. In the and we'll talk about some of the findings as well. So in this study, what they're trying to do is kind of change the way they're training, because they also review some training exercises and show that a lot of them focus on kind of the opposite of what is found in these studies, taking off from the ipsilateral leg, having a narrow shoulder width stance, and so on, right? So their idea was, can we take the data from these studies, which tells us what makes an effective movement solution, and use that to guide strengthening and conditioning and skill training? And what you're going to see is there's some things I like about what they did in the study, some things I don't, and I'll kind of point those out along the way. But I think it's a really interesting approach. I think it's something we really need to keep moving towards, right? We have so many different ways to measure and analyze movement and know what is effective and what isn't. How do we take that to the actual practice field, right? So they're going to do what they're going to do is create a 12-week training program. They call it data-driven because the program is guided by these things, the results of these studies showing, which movements generate the most force, etc. So they're trying to make your the initial stance wider. They're trying to make your push off from the ground more powerful using the contralateral leg. And in the end, getting to towards the actual result we care about, decreasing the movement time to get to the actual save, right? Obviously, we need to kind of keep the end goal in mind, right? Stopping the ball. And there's some limitations with that. We'll see as we go along. Okay. So what did they do? They had 11 goalkeepers. They were all from Dutch national leagues at various levels, some at the highest level. They used motion tracking and force plates to measure kinematics and kinetics while their goalkeepers were performing a diving test. The diving test, one of the big limitations in the study is the diving test was very unecological. It was basically, there was balls suspended at a high and low spot on both sides of the net. The keeper stood in their stance, watched a set of lights. A certain set of light would tell you high to the right, right? And they would dive as quickly as possible to hit the ball. Obviously, this is uncoupled task, right? And it's using non-specifying information. It's using cues. And to kind of review that, there's nothing inherent in the top left light turning on or the second from the bottom light turning on that tells me it's going to be a low shot to my left, right? There's no information there in the Gibsonian sense, right? It's a cue. You have to learn that this light means that. Versus a ball actually having information about its direction and time to contact, specifying where it's going, right? So it's very, very different. Another kind of limitation, this was a completely within subjects design. So what they did not have a control group. They tried to kind of get around that by having two pre-tests. So taking a little bit of the learning effect, but in the end, it's not really that strong. So we don't know exactly if it was the training that accomplished the effects, although there's some pretty strong evidence because they kind of measured the underlying processes. So this is the basic design. The training was kind of a mix of a bunch of different things. So there was some prescriptive instruction. So they asked the goalies to the prescribed initial stance, preparatory stance width of 75% of your leg length. They actually created a ruler for each goalkeeper they put on the ground, and you had to stand at that width. So very, very prescriptive, not something that I would use. They combined this with a bit of differential learning in that the diving saves during training were from a static posture or dynamic moving or actually landing and then diving, right? So they're creating, getting you to explore the solution space. I would call this differential learning because it's not adding a constraint to get you to do something, a certain type of pattern, right? They could have done the constraints that approach with the stance, right? If you just put something on the ground and say you gotta put your legs on around it, right? But you don't have to have this exact width, right? That would be a constraint that encouraged a wider stance. This is getting you to explore different starting postures and different things. So getting you kind of a differential learning approach. The S&C part, the strength and conditioning part, was 6 weeks long, focused on strength, 6 on power. Here's all the different exercises they used. the key points were that the exercises were tailored, data-driven. It was tailored to the information found out about effective diving in soccer, in that most of the exercises were performed with the wider stance rather than shoulder width apart. They all double support and one done on 2 feet. Right, they were required to stand at the 75. All of the exercises, like certain lunges and things, were done with the focusing on the contralateral push off. Right, so the exercises are tailored towards what was found in the research movement analyses on what makes an effective solution. Okay. What did they find? Okay, so what did they find? Again, taking into account there's no control group here, so we don't, it would be nice to see what happened just with regular soccer training. But anyway, they found pre to post, after training, there was increase in the preparatory stance width, not surprisingly. So in the pre and post test, there was no ruler. They just measured how then. It increased to about 65% of your leg length on average in the post test, right? Right. Remember, the stick was 75, so they didn't get the complete change. The movement time, normalized to your starting time, was about 30 milliseconds on average decrease. We'll talk about the significance of that in a second. More power on the contralateral push-off, right, leg. No change in the ipsilateral leg, right, which this gives you a little indication, right, that the effects you're seeing are related to the specific training exercises they did. They're not just some sort of placebo effect or general training effect, because we're getting kind of a targeted effect, change in stance width and a change in power off the contralateral leg, that were the things that were targeted, right? So when you measure not only performance, but also the underlying processes you expect to change, I think that's a really good practice to do in training studies, right? Because when you find a result of a performance, if you can show that the underlying processes you thought would change did change, it gives better support that there's a causal relationship there. So I think that's a very good thing to be doing. These are some of the time series just showing pre and post chaining of the center of mass and things like that. The velocity, you see people are making quicker movements. To kind of quantify the change in movement time, so getting to the actual stopping the shot, they do a nice thing here. I wish more people would do, right? They take the actual effect size they found in their study, which is a decrease of 0.03 seconds, and they show if you take a typical ball speed, that gives a goaltender 0.6 seconds. A reduction of this amount is going to mean that the coverage, if you take both sides, is 42 centimeters greater, right? So they're covering a bigger portion of the net due to this faster movement, right? So I think that's a really good way to kind of show the actual benefits of this. Okay, so I think this is an interesting start in the right direction of taking movement analyses, information about attractors, data from measuring performance, and using it to guide and design practice. But of course, there's some things that I would do differently and limitations. Obviously, you need to demonstrate transfer to the real coupled skill. Using this movement time is limited because being an effective goalkeeper, just like in almost every other sport, is not just about moving as quickly as possible, right? In fact, which is simple reaction time. In fact, what's been shown in other research is the skilled goalkeepers actually wait, right? They wait to move because it gives them more information about where the shot's going. And giving you more faster moving time actually affords that strategy, right? There's research showing that goalkeepers don't do just a ballistic pre-programmed dive like you do in this study. They actually control the information, the movement online, right? So if you're taking in online control and actually stopping the shot that is not going into a fixed location every time, then is the contralateral always better, right? Maybe not. Which is related to my second point, what gets lost in the average? That's a quote from my book, right? Of course, all these things, the 75% stance width, the use of the contralateral leg, they're based on research taking averages from people, right? A group of people. It does not necessarily mean that's the best solution for everyone, right? It's showing the average performance, right? So, and relate to that, obviously, we need to take into account people's intrinsic dynamics. Like this quote from Kelso: "Learning is molding and sculpting of intrinsic dynamics." We need to understand where you're coming from, your own individual constraints. That's maybe why some goalkeepers take off from a different leg than the other, or do different kind of stance widths than the other. It may be a solution that's better fit for them, right? So I think, what we want to do when we can do these kind of biomechanical analyses, do these kind of movement analyses, and whether it's showing that using a bigger arc is better in a basketball shot, taking off from a contralateral leg is better in soccer dive, saving a penalty kick, using a rotational movement is better in a volleyball spike, whatever kind of information we find, right? I think it's useful to get a person to explore that solution, right? If we can create a constraint where that moves them towards that area of solution space, but we can't just nail it on, like put it on top of what they're already doing and expecting them to be able to completely adopt it, right? In some cases, that's not going to work. We have to explore and guide them to that area of solution space. And if it works and it's effective, then hopefully they stay there. If not, then we have to find something that's a better fit for their own individual constraints and intrinsic dynamics, right? So overall, I think a really interesting study. And I think, I would love to see more of this kind of work. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWaves. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.